Hi, I'm Rosanne, and I'm here to talk to you about Introduction to Psychology. I'm going to be trying to share my PowerPoint while we do this. So as you can see, tonight's topic is Introduction to Psychology. I'm hoping that you will have read the chapter, watched Bonnie Beauchart's video, looked at her PowerPoint, and that now you are listening to this prior to our lecture on August 10th at 2100. So what I'm going to be talking about is psychology. And the first thing I want to talk to you about is what we call a paradigm shift. Bonnie talked to you about humanism and psychoanalysis. One of the things we have is what's called a paradigm shift. And we do that is when a theory or an explanation isn't explaining things well enough, that they don't take into account all the things that are occurring, that it doesn't really work in every situation. So then we need to look at the situation in a new way. And that's a paradigm shift. We start to say, wait a minute, this is something we need to add into an explanation. We need to come up with a new theory. That doesn't mean we throw out all the old theories because they may still apply in those situations. So the first thing I'm going to be talking to you about is the paradigm shift that took us away from humanism into cognitive behavioral. And one of the reasons that occurred is the reaction with humanism to behaviorism was a paradigm shift because behaviors, it didn't explain why there were different reactions to the same stimuli. So why is the spider is scary? Why isn't everyone afraid of spiders? The next thing that we looked at is when that paradigm shift, humanism started to look at, well, how people feel, how they think about themselves. But then we start to go, if unconditional positive regard and meeting your needs help you to actualize, why is it that some people, even when that's occurring, they stay depressed? Humanism didn't explain that. The other thing they looked at is, wait a second, there are some times when unconditional positive regard is actually bad for the person. So if we have somebody who we are giving unconditional positive regard to a person who is beating his wife or is engaging in sexually abusive behavior or is doing criminal activity because they like the money it gives them, and we keep giving them positive regard, they may come to believe my behavior is acceptable. I don't have a problem with this. So we found that humanism was not effective with criminals and sex offenders. So they said, okay, it's working here, but here's another place it's not working. And it's not working with everybody who's depressed. What do we need to do? So then they also start to look at unconditional positive regard is the person outside of you saying positive things. And for a lot of people who are depressed, they're internal things they say. What they talk about themselves, I'm ugly, I'm stupid, nobody loves me, is much more important to them, and they believe it much more than the external positive regard they're getting. So that led to what we call cognitive behavioral therapy. And one of the things that it took from psychoanalysis was our thoughts are shaped by what's happened to us. If I've grown up in a family where I am told I am lovable and my parents are good, treat me well, I'm going to grow up with pretty positive feelings about myself. So my thoughts will contribute to me feeling happy. But if I grow up in a place where I'm told you're stupid, I wish you'd never been born, when a teacher at school criticizes me, I'm likely to be much sadder and think, yeah, I'm stupid, nobody wants me. So our internal thoughts start to become, shape our mood and our behavior. So that fits with the psychoanalysis. But with the behavior part, our behavior exposes us to experiences that can make us feel competent, make us feel liked, make us feel have fun, and make us happy. So if we pull those behaviors into therapy, we can be exposing people to things that will make them happy. The same way that we can engage in behaviors that expose us to things that make us feel bad. As a woman, I can date men who are mean, and then I'm going to feel like I'm not very attractive, like I'm not wanted. Cognitive behavioral therapy teaches us to look at those thoughts that affect our mood. And it also takes a look at what behaviors do we need to be getting rid of because they make us feel bad. So eating disorder, not eating makes you feel bad. And how do we replace it with behaviors that make us feel good? So cognitive behavioral therapy is the combination of cognition and behavior. The next thing I want to talk about is multicultural and cross-cultural psychology. And you can see there's all kinds of happy people here, and they're from all kinds of different cultures. And one of the things that we recognized and that we needed to talk about is that different cultures will have different psychological and cultural values. So one of the things we know, all humans have similar needs, and this is going to take you back to Maslow. Everybody needs food. Nobody survives without food. Everybody needs shelter. Without shelter, you're exposed to the elements and you can't focus on anything except staying warm or staying dry. We all need love. If we are unloved, we are unhappy. We all need to be doing something we think is meaningful to really be happy. So we all have those same things. But in culture, those things are met in different ways. So in my family growing up, you had rice at most meals, or you had potatoes. So I'm meeting my food need. In Zambia, you have to have shima with supper. Shima is important food. So it's meeting the food need, but we meet it in different ways. We all may believe in marriage, but the way we do the ceremonies differ. We also have different values around things that we hold as important. In North American culture, many of the people who live here value young people moving out on their own, getting their own place to live, being independent. But I come from a French Canadian background and a Roma background. In our growing up, why would you move out of the house until you were ready to get married or move away to go to school? It's fine to stay living at home. So right now, during COVID, my 26-year-old daughter and her fiance are living in our house because of course they would come home. Whereas other people I know are like, oh no, we couldn't do that. There are cultures where respect for elders is very important. You listen to your elders, they pass on the wisdom. In other cultures, it's much more egalitarian. Anybody could have good ideas. Formal versus informal language. So, sir and ma'am, or you. Different cultures will say, oh no, you need to call him sir. You can't call him, he's an elder. You need to call him sir. So then there's divorce. Some cultures, it's completely acceptable. In other cultures, it's not. And even within cultures, that can vary. I'm needing to pause because I realized I'm running out of power. Just a moment. Okay, I'm back and I think I'm recording again. All right, I think I'm recording again. I really hope I didn't pause too long there. I may need to redo this. Okay, so now, this means when we're talking about mental health, we really have to think about what it means. So if you're talking to someone from a strong Italian background and the 25-year-old woman is talking about stress and anxiety, and she lives at home with her parents. Well, in some cultures, they would say, well, the problem is you're still living under your parents' house, and of course it's stressful. You need to move out and get on your own. But if you think, wait a minute, what's the culture say? That may be very acceptable. Multi-generational families are much more common. So it's really important to think about, how does this fit with your culture? So when you're working with somebody who comes from a different background, you need to figure out what's important to them, what things in their culture happen, and what it matters. We also need to take a look at what symptoms people report to you. In some cultures, what they'll talk about is their physical symptoms. The heart is racing. I have a welling up of pain inside of me. Other peoples will say, oh, I don't know what's wrong, but I cannot talk to my mother anymore. I cannot seem to tell her how I feel. And some will say, oh, I'm anxious all the time and I feel worried. So we need to recognize they may all be describing anxiety, but their culture will make us talk about it in a different way. So there's a thing called the cultural formulation interview that was designed to help clinicians think about that. And I'm going to give you a link to it. And one of the reasons that was developed was the recognition that way too many people who came up with all these ideas of psychology were white men from North America or Europe. And what they understood and what they looked at was what they thought was important. So they didn't always think about what might be important to a Black woman from Southern United States, or a Chinese man from Beijing. They didn't realize those experiences might have made it different and might affect their mental health differently. So this interview that you can go to this website and look at will let you see some of the questions that we encourage people to ask when they realize somebody's coming from a different culture. The other thing is, believe it or not, there are some mental health issues that only occur in certain cultures because it's a combination of behaviors and emotions that people experience. So Latinx in the United States will talk about ataque de nervios. And it's very similar to a panic attack, but it often happens because you're having a fight with someone important to you in your family. Kyle Cap, which I may be pronouncing completely wrong, is what it means wind attacks. It's a Cambodian illness. And they talk about the breath becomes tight and the wind moves through your lungs. And there's other Asian countries have similar ones. And it's very similar to what North Americans and Europeans would call an anxiety attack. Maladie Moon, that in Haiti means a human-caused illness. And what they talk about is when somebody is spiteful towards you and angry at you because you have hurt them or harmed them, you will get sick because of their spite coming onto you. As a person from North America, I probably say, oh my gosh, you must be feeling a lot of guilt. And that's why you're feeling sick. But that illness in Haiti is defined quite differently. So the features are similar to what we consider traditional psychiatric illnesses, but we remember that they need to remember there are features that are culturally unique. And I had a really interesting experience when I had a young woman from Taiwan living with me, and she was experiencing anxiety. And I said, oh, here's what you can do to help it. And she looked at me and she said, my doctor at home said there was nothing I could do. I get anxious because I have too much yang and I'm out of balance. And I kind of went, well, that may be true and you'll have to figure out how to balance that, but let's do this as well. And I'm sure if I went to Taiwan and said, I've got anxiety, they might tell me, oh, wow, she thinks she's got anxiety when it's just she has too much yang. So it's important to realize that when I'm talking about this, I'm still coming from my white North American bias. Although, as I said, I've got some odd bits back there too. The next thing I wanted to talk to you about is women in psychology. For a long time, it was mostly males who did psychological research. And there's been a number of women over the years, many of whom have done some very important things. But some of the reasons why we really need to consider women in psychology is clinical problems present differently in men and women. So depressed women with children often get more activities of daily living completed than a depressed man, because even if she is depressed, somebody has to get up and feed the baby. Somebody has to change the baby's diaper. So sometimes women who are very, very depressed look better than a man who's just as depressed as that, because they're getting more things done every day. We also need to look at one of the things we looked at is suicide in men and women is very different. And so sometimes they talk about women doing suicidal gestures. They don't really mean to kill themselves, it's just a gesture. But what they started to look at was men and women choose different methods. Men in North America are more likely to choose a gun or jumping off something, and you're less likely to survive that. Whereas women choose methods like pills or cutting. And those are ones that we can, if we catch them in time, we can save them, but you can't save somebody who's done one of the other two methods. So we know that differences in suicide rates, partly it's about you choose the kind of method. We also know that there are different triggering events for men and women. And we also know that men who are single, that increases your risk of suicide. If I am depressed and single and I'm a man, my risk of suicide goes up. But if I'm depressed and single and a woman, that's not the thing that's going to increase my suicide risk. The other reason we needed women involved is a lot of times in traditional personality theory, there were traits that were given to women and were seen as feminine, but if they were seen in men, it was unhealthy. And we started to change that as more women got involved and women started to say, wait, well, but no, that's not a trait I want to have. So we used to say things like, oh, women being calm, women are more passive, women are more reserved. And then women start to say, well, no, I do that because I feel pressure to do that. So it's really important that we look at cultural differences, gender differences, but that we also look at the experiences of each gender so we start to understand what matters to them and what's important. So the next thing we're going to talk about is contemporary psychology. Psychology keeps changing, psychology keeps growing. And one of the things that's happened is psychology has become more and more recognized as a distinct science with distinct methods, research that's being done. It's not just, well, I kind of think this might help. What we are using, the techniques we use, Carl Rogers, his unconditional positive regard, they did research and they found, wow, this really works well with people with low self-esteem, with people with depression, with people with social avoidance. So we started to say we have real meaning to this. Cognitive behavioral therapy works really well with people with anxiety, works really well with people with negative self-evaluation and depression. So what's happened is groups of psychologists have come together to say, let's share our research. Let's share our knowledge of what works. They offer connections to other psychologists. They offer mentoring. So if you're a newly graduated psychologist, they'll help you with your training and your teaching. So two of the things I put up here is I belong to the Ontario Psychological Association. I belong to the College of Psychologists of Ontario. I used to belong to the Canadian Registry of Health Service Providers in Psychology. But those are all professional development places where I can go to get support and help, where I can go to conferences and learn. What I think is really important is Zambia has a psychology association, and I've given you the link here. And if you go to it, you'll see that they post articles about psychology. They have things written up about what's happening in Zambia that's important in terms of mental health and how we can deal with it, or how the people in Zambia can deal with it. There's also, they have a Facebook page, and you can go to it. And again, you can make comments. They have postings of important articles. They've got posting of news that's important. They talk about things that you can go to learn more. So I really want you to go and visit those two websites. And when we talk about contemporary psychology, one of the reasons that we're talking about it is there are so many different types. So one of the ones we're going to talk about is biopsychology and evolutionary psychology. And one of the things we looked at is what parts of the brain are in charge of different things. And two of the first they learned about are what we call Wernicke's area and Broca's area. Those are very involved in understanding language. Damage to those areas make it difficult for people to speak. They may understand what you are saying, but when they try to speak to you, it's gibberish. Or you get the reverse, when they can give you a complete sentence that sounds coherent and logical, but they can't understand what you say to them. So you'll say to them, "Oh, isn't the weather nice? I had a red bicycle when I was a child." So biopsychology looks at what different parts of the brain and what are they doing? How do our senses work? And how do we react to that? And it really looks at what we call our central nervous system, which is our brain, and it's where all the information comes in for us to go, what's going on in the world? How should I react? What am I seeing? And our peripheral nervous system. So our central is our brain that takes all that information and combines it to go, oh, I touched something, I saw something, I heard something, that's my dog. It takes all the information and goes, dog. So all those peripheral nerves, and we talk about the five senses, there's really a lot more than that, because there's kinesthetic, which is your ability to feel your balance. There is an awareness of time, which is a sense. And that peripheral nervous system is what's bringing in those senses. Biopsychology also looks at sleep. What disrupts sleep? How do we fall asleep? And for a long time, they were going, why do we need to sleep? What are we doing when we're asleep? So biopsychology is looking at those kinds of things and looking at why people have problems with sleep. It also looks at the biochemistry of mood disorders and thought disorders. Therapy won't do much for a person with schizophrenia. It's a biological illness. It's all about the levels of dopamine in your brain, and the receptors at the back of your brain for dopamine and norepinephrine aren't properly receiving it. So biopsychology goes, how does medication work? What kind of brain neurotransmitters do we need to modify? Biopsychology also looks at genetic disorders with psychiatric features. So it might look at an individual with Down syndrome and go, what's going on genetically that leads them to have this presentation? Why does autism run in families? Why do people who have schizophrenia, why are their children and relatives more likely to have schizophrenia? So it's looking, biopsychology is looking at that genetic interplay. Then we talk about evolutionary psychology. And that's looking at how did our ancient past and our natural selection impact on our psychological development? So I'm going to talk about anxiety. We always talk about anxiety if it's a bad thing. But anxiety triggers our fight, flight, or freeze response. So that if I see a lion coming at me, I'm going to get anxious and I'm going to start to run. I need that anxiety to escape and be safe. If I am, as a woman, walking down a dark street at night and I hear somebody walking behind me and I turn around and it's a scary looking man and he's got a knife, my anxiety goes, run. If I see somebody trying to grab my child, I get scared, but my anxiety goes, fight, get him off your child. So anxiety developed because it helps our heart rate speed up. It helps us release epinephrine so we can move faster. So there's biological reasons that it's a good thing. Bonding is another thing. Bonding between a husband and wife keeps us together as a couple, sticking up for each other, taking care of each other. Between parent and child, it means that we aren't going to just walk away and leave our child to die. We're going to take care of them. Margaret Mead, she stated that one of the first signs of civilization was finding the remains and the skeleton of a man who had broken his leg as a child. Animals, if you break your leg, you're probably going to be left behind and die and starve to death. But humans take care of their injured. And so she said, our caring for one another is one of the first signs of humanity and civilization. One of the problems is we can look at these things and make connections, but it's really hard to prove them. But it is really important to remember that some of the things that we do, we have very good reasons for doing them because were important to our survival and still are in some cases. Another area of study that a lot of people do is sensation and perception. How do our senses work? If you get your big toe cut off, your big toe is really important in sending information to your body. And they discover that people without it have really difficult problems with balance. So people who study sensation and perception want to know, why do you have really difficult problems? They want to look at what do we detect and what do we miss? So one of the things that's kind of interesting, eyewitness testimony, is about sensation and perception. If we show you something, will you see it or will you miss it? So I'm going to put up a kind of cute little video and see if you can see what we mean by what do you miss and what do you detect. They also look at how do senses play into memory, because we know that a strong smell can bring back a lot of memories. We know that seeing something can bring back a lot of memories. So one of the things I'm going to say, when I was a child, I had to have physiotherapy because I was quite ill, and it was quite painful to have it. And I never really thought about it. But I happened to be in the city where I had been living when I was having physiotherapy. And my mother and I drove past the building. And I looked, I said, I know that building. I don't like that building. And my mom said, well, that's where you had physiotherapy. You hated it because it hurt. And all of a sudden it was like, oh my gosh, that visual memory, that visual cue made me bring up a whole bunch of memories. So that's another thing we're looking at in sensation and memory, in sensation and perception. Then there's cognitive psychology. We've talked about cognitive behavioral with the therapy. Cognitive psychology looks at how we think. What is intelligence? A recent development in cognitive psychology is we've been talking about, we've always focused on intelligence as understanding. But now they're talking about a thing called emotional intelligence. And there are some people who have really good ability to read emotions. And they start to say, hang on, this is another piece of intelligence. Cognitive psychology looks at how do we problem solve? And then finally, it looks at how do thoughts affect our mood and our decisions. So next section, developmental psychology. And I want to show you this because you can see in the one picture, it goes from babies to grandparents. And we've got another picture where it's little kids to grown-ups. And that's what developmental psychology is all about. Throughout our lives, we are changing. And in babies, it's obvious. They start off little, and the next thing you know, they're grown up, they're big. Everything is changing and new. They're learning how to walk, they're learning how to talk. But teenagers are changing too. Who am I? What do I want to be when I grow up? Who do I want to go out with? Who do I want to marry? Adults are changing too. How am I going to be a parent? Is this the person I'm going to spend the rest of my life with? As I get older, how am I going to take care of my parents? As we get older, we start to think about, well, I'm going to be gone. How do I pass on my knowledge? How do I prepare for the loss of my loved ones? How do I prepare for dying? What do I believe in as I get ready to leave this world? And one of the big things that they look at a lot is how does religion and faith play out in that stage of life? So developmental psychology is looking at all those stages and how we are making those changes. Personality psychology is one that a lot of people think is about multiple personality disorder, but it's personality traits. How come some people are shy and how come some people are outgoing? Is it inborn? Some people are born shy and some people are born outgoing. Is it developmental? I was started off shy, but as I met more and more people, I stopped being shy. How do we measure them? Can we change them? And one of the things is, what we know is extreme versions of a personality trait can become a disorder. Being organized is a good thing, but if I get super anxious when I'm disorganized and I get mad at my husband when he doesn't put the things the way I want them, I may have an obsessive personality disorder. So personality psychology is looking at those behaviors and those traits that are personality. Now, this is just for you to do for fun. There is a personality test online. You can go and do it, and it gives you an idea. Am I an introvert? Am I an extrovert? Am I calm or am I excited? And it just looks at your personality style. We tend to view personality traits on a continuum from good to bad. We tend to say it's good to be kind, disinterested is kind of neutral, mean is bad. Generous is good. Well, he's not generous, but he will share. That's in the middle. Greedy is bad. So it's important that we realize that a personality trait is kind of a spectrum. It goes from small to large. But the other thing is we need to remember is how we describe it can change a trait from positive to negative. So if I say, he is so cheap, he never spends money, that sounds nasty. He's very frugal. He is careful about where he spends his money. He works hard to save money so that there's money there if there's an emergency. I'm describing the same behavior, but in English, cheap is an insult, frugal is a compliment. I'm not sure if there's an equivalent in Zambian, but another one might be obnoxious. Oh, she's loud. She's always, talking. She's never sitting still. She's obnoxious. She bugs us. She's exuberant. She's loud and she's talkative. And it's fun to watch her. Same behaviors, but depending how we label it, it can be different. The next one is social psychology. A lot of people are doing research on social psychology. How do people behave in groups? And they'll talk in the text, they talked about the Milgram experiment. And that happened after World War II. And people were saying, how could they have done those terrible things? How could they have killed children? How could they have done that? So Milgram hired a group of students and he said, oh, we're looking at how much electric shock people can handle. And so the students were told to shock the person, and the person was in a different room. And the person pretended to be shocked. And some people said, oh, I can't do this. That hurt him. And the person doing this said, oh, well, you really need to do it. If you don't shock him, if I can't do this, I'm going to fail my class. Everybody else is doing it. What's your problem? And they found that with that kind of pressure, a lot of people kept giving the shocks. Another social psychology study is the one they call the prisoner study, where they divided groups into prisoners and guards. And they told the guards, you can do whatever you want to make these prisoners behave over the next 5 days. And they found that some of the guards got crueler and crueler. And the guards who weren't like that were afraid to stand up to them because they didn't want to get bullied. So we found that the presence of the cruel people affected the other one. And that's what we look at in bullying. There's also a famous study called the Kitty Genovese. And this is based on a real incident where a young woman was murdered. And there's some controversy about how many people witnessed it. But it is known that there were a number of people who could hear her crying for help, and nobody called the police. And what that was labeled as was bystander apathy. And what was happening is people assumed somebody in a different apartment, somebody must have called. I don't need to call because somebody else must have called. So what we find is that if somebody speaks up, other people in the group speak up. So if you watch a car accident, nobody goes to help, nobody will go to help. But as soon as one person is brave enough to go and help, lots of people start to help. We are very influenced by the group around us, even though we may want to think we aren't. So here's an experiment you can do. And this one's kind of fun because my daughter went to a program where she learned about psychology when she was about 12 or 13. And they did this experiment. What you do is you stop and you stare at the sky. And you have a friend stop with you and stare, and you can point if you want. And if you need, get another friend. So now there are 3 of you looking at the sky. And if you need more, but I want you to find out, how many people do we need in the group before the people walking by start to do this? So when my daughter was at this program, they found that as soon as they got 4 or 5 people stopped and looking up, and these were children, remember, these were 12 or 13-year-old kids. As soon as they had 4 or 5 12 or 13-year-old kids looking at the sky like this, the grown-ups walking past them start to slow down and do this too, because they assumed that that social group knew something. So that's an example of social psychology. Industrial organizational psychology, I'll be honest, this is not an area I've ever been involved in because it's all about using psychology to help businesses be successful. So industrial organizational psychologists will do things like, is this person or this type of person better suited to this job? If is this person, if we do this test on him, do we think he could be successful in the military, or is he the kind of person who won't be able to handle it? They can also do things like go into a factory and try out things and go, what's the best schedule of breaks to have in this factory to keep our maximum level of efficiency? They actually did a lengthy study on what kind of light causes the least stress in a factory. So they're looking at things like how to make the business run well. And health psychology is what it sounds like. How does stress affect my health? How does depression affect my health? So we know, like stress, if you're highly stressed, it affects heart attacks. But it's about using psychology to change unhealthy behavior patterns. So how do we use psychology and cognitive behavioral therapy to help people stop overeating? Addiction. So the 12-step AA program uses a lot of steps in it that are about psychology, admitting I have no control, handing that control to a higher power, thinking about what I do that hurts others and how it hurts me. That's very much about using psychology to change the behavior pattern. It can also be used to change unsafe sexual behavior, getting people to realize this puts me at risk, I'm not immune. So that's what health psychology is. Sport and exercise psychology. This is actually a field. Most Olympic teams have a sports psychologist because people get performance anxiety and they need to be helped with it. They need to visualize themselves having success. They need to be mentally on top of their game as well as physically on top of their game. So a sports psychologist works with those. Now, clinical psychology is why you all want to be here. It's using psychology to treat mental health issues. And the thing is, there's all kinds of different approaches. And all of them work in different ways with different kinds of clients. Like psychoanalytic theory and psychodynamic, it's probably not very good when what you're dealing with is somebody who has an eating disorder. But it could be really good with somebody who's dealing with, why don't I trust people? Why can't I bring myself to be honest with my wife? Humanism, cognitive behavioral, feminist. And even though they all come from kind of different models, they all may use similar techniques. But that's what clinical psychology is. Forensic psychology. I've actually worked as a forensic psychologist, and there are psychologists who work with crime. They may look at whether an individual is competent to stand trial. They look at, how do we treat offenders? You know, this person's going to get out someday. How do we make sure he doesn't reoffend? How do we understand what causes these behaviors and what we can do that will stop it? A forensic psychologist in North America and Europe may also look at things like custody and access. Which parent is the better parent? Is this child going to be safe with this parent? This parent has mental illness. Can this parent really take care of this child? So that's some of the 5 senses. So obviously, there's a lot of jobs out there. So, and your educational requirements differ in different countries, so I'm not going to get into that. But you could be a counselor, you could do psychotherapy, you could work in school, figuring out how to help children learn. You can work in business, doing things like HR or human relationships. You could work in research. You could be a teacher. Understanding psychology can really help you teach. You can work in childhood development. How do we help kids learn and grow? So there's a lot of careers. And I'm hoping that what we're doing with this is helping you to understand all the different kinds of things that are out there to learn about in psychology, and that by the end of this, you will have learned through this introduction to psychology a little bit about each one of those sections, so that when we start building onto it for the family therapy, you'll be able to go, here's one of the reasons that this young person is causing difficulty in their family. Here's how this person is depressed and what we can do with them. So that's what's causing problems. If you're very depressed, you're not necessarily giving your partner what they need, and that's going to cause a marriage problem. So all of this is about helping with those things. And I hope you enjoyed this. I am now going to try and stop the recording and see if I can upload it. So I may be on the phone to Bonnie tonight going, help me. And good night, and I hope you enjoyed this, and I'm looking forward to talking with you all.